presentation with Matthew Toth, who is a PhD student excuse me, in musicology at Western University in London, Canada, and holds previous degrees from Stony Brook and McGill. His work focuses on art music of the past 50 years with a particular interest in topics related to philosophy, listening, and queer theory. He's currently working on a dissertation about the aesthetics of musical memorials, focusing on works by John Adams, Bob Ostertag, and Istvan Anhalt.
Thanks. So this sound speculation spectra, a good old 3 nouns and a colon academic title. This came out of, partially came out of a reading group where we were reading a bunch of speculative realist material, and I wanted to just kind of do something with it to see what it did. And also came out of interacting with a lot of the kind of questions that have come up in some of the other papers, and just trying to figure out, as music is kind of my corner, so just trying to figure out, okay, so what can I do anything with concert works in this kind of space, and what can I get them, kind of what can I play around and get them to do? So that's a bit of where this is coming from. A passage from The Flamethrowers, Rachel Kushner's novel from this past spring, about speed, motorcycles, art, and the Italian labor riots of the 1970s, has stuck in my head as I've been considering the aesthetic implications of the material emphasis suggested by speculative realism. This might be especially resonant given some of the references to art and objecthood that came up yesterday. In this passage, the unnamed protagonist thinks to herself as someone flips through a catalog of her boyfriend's works. She's thinking, minimalism is a language, and even having gone to art school, I barely spoke it myself. I knew the basic idea that the objects were not meant to refer to anything but what they were there in the room. Except, of course, that this was not really true, because they referred to a discourse that artists such as Sandro wrote long essays about. And if you didn't know the discourse, you couldn't take them for what they were or what they were meant to be. You were simply confused, end quote. I won't spoil how the relationship ends, don't worry. The concern that by talking about matter or objects, we fix them in place and preclude the possibility of letting them talk about themselves is certainly nothing new, but still something about this passage and the concerns it expresses about how we talk ourselves back into the same old inside-outside dynamics has stayed with me. Quentin Mesu's name has come up more than a few times this week, in terms of questions of what we can know and what remains obscure. In After Finitude, we get a double move whereby there is a world outside of and indifferent to thought, but as well, we can know things about this world. We're still working out the kinks about the ways that we can do so, but best guesses at this moment have to do with mathematics or one of the sciences, probably physics. I'd like to try another approach to these questions. And this is as good a place to start as any. In the transcription to the 2007 Speculative Realism Workshop recorded in Collapse Volume 3, Ray Brassier asks whether we have the resources available to describe the world without us, at one point asking, can we be sure that these self-organizing features of material reality can be linguistically encoded and encapsulated? Though this question is just an aside, and though there is something disingenuous to treating it as a question on its own and not as a part of a larger train of thought, this passage has also stuck with me, much like the passage from The Flamethrowers. While on the one hand we have the danger that whenever we say art is about the objects themselves, it is in actuality less about the object than it is about the statements we make about it. On the other hand, while we have the assurance that we can know things about those objects outside ourselves and free ourselves from the inability to say anything about them, there's no guarantee that the things that we could know are available to language or mathematics or just about anything else. These aren't questions that I'm going to answer, but they're ones that I'd like to experiment with, to lay my cards fully on the table. What I'd like to test out is the idea that certain pieces of music being meant here in the widest sense of the word, one that acknowledges the lesson learned from ethnomusicology that there's no possibility of a categorical definition of the term. If certain pieces of music could be ways to speculate about the sonic. The music that I'm going to be considering in this case is French spectral composer Gérard Grisey's work Partiels from 1975, as part of his larger work Les Espaces Acoustiques, written between 1974 and 1985. Spectral music makes use of advances made in the 1970s in the imaging of sounds. Composers took this new ability to see the physical structure of sounds and used it as a way to structure elements of their own compositions, mostly along formal and harmonic lines. I'll get to more details of how exactly this plays out in the space of the piece, but first let's listen to the opening couple of minutes. So this opening section that I just played for you is a sort of textbook example used to illustrate a lot of the concerns faced by spectral composers. And I should mention that the spectral composers, they never wrote a manifesto. It's like calling them a group is a bit disingenuous. But generally it means composers who are reacting to the physical realities of sound spectra and incorporating and feeding it back into their works, or the other thing they talk a lot about is a concern or preoccupation with how sound evolves or decays in time, and kind of exploring how that has musical implications. As I had mentioned before, technological advances had made it possible to see the structure of sounds to a higher degree of resolution than ever before. This glimpse into the physical structure of any given sound and into the ways that sound changed and developed over time gave composers the ability to expect new answers to some old questions about what sounds are, how they can be represented, and how they can be exploited musically. What is generally meant by the structure of sounds here, in the case that I'm using it, is their overtone series. That series of partials activated by a fundamental that gives a particular sound its timbre or tone color. This is why an E played on a harp sounds different than an E played on an English horn, which sounds different than an E accidentally screamed by a child. The opening to Partiels is based on the overtone series of the recurring low E played by the trombone and doubled by the double bass that you heard in the example. This example here shows the first 32 partials of an overtone series played by a trombone on this low E. So imagine this is like light refracted into a spectrum. This is the different pitch series. This is the pitch series that you get out of that fundamental low E labeled pitch number 1. A number of things stand out when we take a look. First of all, you can see here that the first 6 partials, and if you can't read music, don't worry about it. The first 6 notes, if you look at those pitches, they form an E major chord. We've known about the overtone series for a little while, And using it to justify preconceived notions that we have about music is nothing terribly new. It's a really old party trick, actually. Milton Babbitt called it the overtone follies. For example, Rameau, back in the 18th century, used the first 6 partials as justification for the natural basis of the major chord through what he called the corps sonore. What's interesting here, in what the spectralists are doing, and what Grisey is doing here, is that, in this case, we keep going past 6. Rameau had no choice but to stop at the 6th partial because, as you can see, once you get to number 7, we run into problems. That 1/6 with the little arrow pointing down means that that note is actually 1/6 of a tone flat from how it's notated. The pitch D, which the D on its own doesn't really fit with an E major chord, but that's no big deal. These numerological puzzles always have some sort of Da Vinci Code solution if we really want them to. What's more interesting is that in this case, it's out of tune, flat by 1/6 of a tone. This means that sound's natural structure does not fit in the striated space of 12-tone equal-tempered octave, or even the striated-ish space of mean tone tuning. The further you go up in the overtone series, the more of these warps in sonic space, what Reza Negrestani might call plot holes, crop up. And these holes proliferate past the overtone series. The spectrum as such perforates some of the basic distinctions that we use to talk about music. Harmony, as it turns out, is really just a single pitch. Timbre is really a harmony, and each pitch of a melody is really a multitude. Sonic reality is bigger than the things that we can say about it. This sonic reality becomes even wider and rockier when we consider the contingency of this spectrum that I have displayed in front of you. This particular overtone series is based on a trombone playing a low E, 41.2 hertz, so just a bit lower than our 60 hertz from yesterday. The pitch that opens Partiels. Changing the instrument being played, or even changing the way the instrument is being played, will change this overtone series. This is probably old hat to a lot of you, but good to go over nonetheless. If this were played on a piano, the first octave would be a bit wide, rather than some of the other irregularities happening here. Playing on the same trombone but louder would change the timbre and change the distribution of the partials. These warps in the overtone series always happen as long as we deal with the material world. The only way you don't get them is if you have a perfectly idealized string with no mass and no resistance. That would be the only way to produce a pure harmonic spectrum, Plato's G string, if you will. At this point, it bears explaining in a little bit more detail how we arrive at this particular overtone series. For a long time, sound imaging meant using sonograms that look something like this. The sonogram shows a temporal evolution of the sound pressure wave, so time on the bottom, pressure going up the side, constrained by whatever visual resolution of the system we're using to create the representation. Sonograms were good for cutting and splicing and flipping sound around, other types of manipulation, but you can see that from this you can't really get to the overtone series that I was showing you before. To be able to do so requires the use of what's called a Fourier transform, which has been alluded to in another couple of the presentations. This makes use of Fourier's theory that any complex signal can be decomposed into a sum of sinusoidal waves over an infinite time frame by specifying precisely their relative amplitudes and phases. This makes it possible to decompose a complex sound into a sum of sine tones. This is what people like Stockhausen did through they called it additive synthesis. Each of these sine tones is what I've been calling a partial of the sound, and the full set of them is called the spectrum. The results look something like this. So here you can see we don't have time on this because it's theoretically happening over an infinite duration. But we do have, you can see all these spikes that correspond to certain frequencies that then we can derive certain pitches from. It should be noted that while we gain the ability to see the partials with a greater degree of certainty, temporal dimension here becomes irrelevant. As I said, it's happening over an infinite span of time. So we can no longer see the evolution of the sound over time in the same way that we did with the spectrogram, but we do gain the ability to see the pitch content of the spectrum. And then going from this, what they were actually using in the 70s was something called a fast Fourier transform, which took kind of instant slices, so kind of reintroducing time into it with a certain degree of resolution. The mathematics are complicated, and I don't totally understand it, so that's why it's only getting kind of a side note here. I'm sure someone here could explain it better than I can. The opening section of Partiels, in the opening section of Partiels, we could hear the fundamental E played on the trombone, alternating with harmonies that Grisey takes from the spectrum revealed by the Fourier transform. Here's an example of what one of those harmonies, how one of those harmonies orchestrates the partials from the spectrum. So you can see the analyst Francois Rose here has numbered all the notes in that harmony on the right, and each one of those numbers corresponds to one of the notes from the spectrum. There's a number of strategies at work in the way that Grisey orchestrated this sound. First of all, it should be pointed out that while Grisey is having instruments play different parts of the spectrum, the partials revealed through Fourier's theory are theoretically pure sine tones. So playing these with instruments rather than with sine tones is going to add all sorts of unpredictable sonic interactions between the different instruments. Sine tone is just a pure harmonic spectrum, while material instruments played in the material world each have their own spectral quirks and the potential to affect one another. The partials used in each harmony are also chosen based on their degrees of inharmonicity. Intervals that can be expressed in terms of whole number multiples of the fundamental are called harmonic, while those that are not whole number multiples of the fundamental are called inharmonic. These mathematical realities have very perceptible effects. As I'm sure everyone knows, it's the whole number ratios that create the intervals discovered in Greek musical experimentation that came to be called perfect or consonant intervals in Western musical traditions. I don't really have enough experience with other musical traditions to speak to them, though these intervals are certainly an acoustic reality that lots of people deal with. These are proportions like 1 to 2 gives you the octave, 3 to 2 gives you the fifth, 4 to 3 gives you the fourth, etc. Grisey strategically uses the inharmonic tones, having them accumulate over the course of the section, as shown in this example from the Rose article. And it doesn't show up as well here, but if you're close enough, you can see that harmonic notes are written white, inharmonic notes are written in black. And the inharmonic notes are the more dissonant sounding ones that have non-whole number ratio relationships with the fundamental. As we progress from harmonicity to inharmonicity, noise elements are added to the orchestration. And this is listed in the resolution, it's not too good. This is listed in the bottom kind of row of the table. So as string players, so things will happen like string players adding pressure to their bowing, wind players rapidly changing dynamics over the course of a sustained sound, anything that will add kind of noise or just kind of sounds of the instrument that weren't intended in the tone. Thus, the development is extended from harmonicity to inharmonicity, even further to noise. This brings up an interesting question, as harmonicity and inharmonicity are sonic qualities that are directly perceptible by humans, and quite easily so. Does this mean that we've run into the problem the protagonist from the flamethrowers ran into? Has Grisey sacrificed some sort of opportunity to represent certain sonic realities that exist outside of human perception to instead pander to his listeners by arranging sonic elements in terms of how the human reactions they elicit would create a growing sense of drama? Perhaps this is a turning away from true experimentalism, one that would shatter the foundations of artistic practice, focusing us to confront the realities of a world outside. It was a great the answer to those questions is going to be no, as you'll see in a bit. It was of great concern to many of the spectral composers that their compositional strategies be, to at least some degree, perceptible ones. Thus, looking at the structure of sound spectra isn't quite enough. As scholar Robert Hasegawa puts it, quote, while such studies can explain how nature is harnessed in Grisey's music, they tend to overlook the equally important role played by nature in quite a different sense. The way our innate mechanisms of oral perception make sense of musical sound, end quote. The innate mechanisms that Hasegawa refers to take a number of forms, a lot of which have been talked about over this weekend, so I won't go into too much detail. Things like sum and difference tones, Bregman's auditory scene analysis, we've kind of mentioned all of those. As I'm sure everyone here's well aware, these bodily effects are not combined to the brain and ear, but also include phenomena such as entrainment, like Mark was talking about, of circulatory, respiratory systems to sonic stimuli. As David's 1,000-foot Doppler ganger showed, basic physical aspects of our embodiment and the ways that we can act in the world shape the sonic reality as well. And as there was a lot of discussion about what kind of effects those would entail, this is incredibly varies a lot from person to person. At this point, there seems to be two types of sound to explore. There's the vibratory events in the air around us, and there are the structures within us that have grown around the structure of sound over the long span of human evolution. The physical matters that have led to us being able to hear some sounds and not others. The furrows that the claws of sound have dredged through our being, resulting in certain sonic facts being folded right into our bodies. Sound would still be here even if hearing hadn't grown up around it, but the relationship between the two means that they don't remain unknown from one another. While scientific investigation has given us insight into how some of these bodily processes work, it's important to note that the complete picture is more complex than we can fit into any of the frames that we have. As Timothy Morton has noted, nature is indeed monstrous. Ethnomusicologist Judith Becker expresses the same sort of an idea in an essay in the collection Music, Science, and the Rhythmic Brain. Drawing on her ethnographic research about trance musics in indigenous South American cultures, Becker notes that while we have been able to isolate some of the workings of the brain that might contribute to the musical stimulation of certain trance states, the environments where medical research is conducted and the environments where trance ritual happen could not be more different. Research subjects are listening to music in environments where they're isolated and often surrounded by cumbersome machinery, and totally enclosed if they're doing any sort of brain scan. Far from the social, comfortable, and often pleasurable environments where music making and listening often happen. So it's not to say that this means that scientific research is not capturing something of the spirit of music, more that scientific research happens in a radically simplified environment, or scientific research as it now happens in a radically simplified environment where we are working our hardest to reduce interference with the things that we want to isolate. Entrainment, Becker points out, wouldn't work in just one direction between listener and music in any of the trance ceremonies she was studying. Instead, it would work in multiple directions, between multiple listeners, feeding back and forth between different bodies and different bodily reactions to the music. Just as the perfect geometry of the sine wave becomes warped when played by real instruments in real space, and just as Grisey invites unknown interactions by scoring the sine waves of the Fourier transform for real instruments, we can grasp something of the workings of sound folded inside of us, but there is still possibility for the chaotic reactions that go beyond what our models can so far tell us. In the section of Cyclonopedia titled A Good Meal, Negrestani talks about how, quote, openness is not ultimately, so to speak, the affair of humans, but rather the affair of the outside. Everything minus the human, even the human's own body, end quote. It's in this sense, finally, that I mean the music inside, a way that sound has perforated the body, so we find that we have grown around something inhuman. Negrestani's account of openness as not ultimately concerning humans has implications for how we should behave, should we want to court this outside. He writes, and this is a long quote, but it's a good one, so let's read it all. To become open or to experience the chemistry of openness is not possible through opening yourself, a desire associated with boundary, capacity, and survival economy, which covers both you and your environment. But it can be affirmed by entrapping yourself within a strategic alignment with the outside, becoming a lure for its exterior forces. Radical openness can be invoked by becoming more of a target for the outside. In order to be opened by the outside, rather than being economically open to the system's environment, one must seduce the exterior forces of the outside. You can erect yourself as a solid and molar volume, tightening boundaries around yourself, securing your horizon, sealing yourself off from any vulnerability, immersing yourself deeper into your human hygiene, and becoming vigilant against outsiders. Through the success of paranoia, rigorous closure, and survivalist vigilance, one becomes an ideal prey for the radical outside and its forces. The idea here is that practices that work by opening to outside forces rather than being opened by them, ultimately only open themselves to a version of the outside that the subject has already decided that she can afford. Instead, Negrestani advises making ourselves into an object on which the outside can act, or not, as it so chooses. This does not mean that there's nothing that we can do at all. Negrestani here is talks about adopting strategies towards luring or attracting the outside, making ourselves a good meal for its jaws. And it's in these terms, finally, that I want to think of Partiels. Using scientific reason to change our notions of what sound can be and where it is, using musical tools that can often be conservative and molar as a way of attracting forces of sound to strike. The concert hall has been called by many the tomb of Western culture, dead space, dead weight, the altar of forgotten highbrow aesthetics. But perhaps it turns out that we were right, but that we never really knew which hand was holding the knife. The acts of composition, performance, and listening all turn into wagers, speculations that something might happen, even as we know that we can't identify all the forces at work or guarantee that they will act. Experiments can fail, but even more dangerously, sometimes they can succeed. And what form will success take? While in its more financial sense, a person placing a wager or speculating on a market has at least some say in the way she will be paid back should the wager turn profitable. Wagering with the outside in Negrestani's sense means letting go of having any say in which currency the wager is made. You may win, you may lose, or even more probable, you may not even be noticed. I started with a fiction, and I'd like to finish with another one. This is from a novel called, by Dan Simmons, yes, science fiction fans, the one who wrote Hyperion, called The Terror. The novel imagines what might have happened during the 1845 Franklin expedition to try and find the Northwest Passage, exploring Negrestanian plot holes in the accounts found of the famously disastrous expedition. While trying to find the source of a strange sound out on the ice one Arctic midnight, a sailor walks in on the following scene, to identify the characters. Irving is the sailor, and Lady Silence is the name of the Eskimo stowaway that he has walked in on. Silence, Lady Silence, without a tongue, made no noise, but her arms were thrown wide, her eyes were closed, her head was thrown back. Irving had crawled far enough toward that he could see her face now, and her mouth was open and wide, like a supplicant awaiting communion. The creature's neck thrust forward and down as quickly as a cobra's strike, and the thing's jaws opened wide and seemed to snap shut on Lady Silence's lower face, devouring half her head. The music then began. Irving saw the bobbing of both heads, the creatures and the Eskimos, but it took him half a minute before he realized that the orgiastic bass hootings and erotic bagpipe flute notes were emanating from the woman. The monstrous thing, looming as large as the ice boulders beside it, white bear or demon, was blowing down into her open mouth, playing her vocal cords as if her human throat were a reed instrument. The trills and low notes and bass resonances came louder, faster, and more urgently. He saw Lady Silence raise her head and bend her neck one way while the serpentine-necked, triangular-headed bear thing above her bent its head and neck in the opposite direction, the two looking like nothing so much as lovers straining to plunge deeper while seeking to find the best and deepest angle for a passionate, open-mouthed kiss. End quote. This is the Negrestanian aesthetics of sound at work, strategies for charming down a beast who goes straight for the neck, but for purposes we can't possibly fathom. A parody of the Kantian sublime where we stare up into the fanged noumena of the stars. Thanks.